Hey everyone, it's Cire here, and today I'm going to teach you how I paint green for Nurgle, or things like Maggotkin, Deathguard, or in this case, a Chaos Knight with a Mark of Nurgle. So before we even start priming, we want to add some texture to the model, and we can do this by adding a couple of texture paints. So in this case I use Typhus Corrosion by Citadel. It's kind of a bumpy surface. You don't have to use this exact paint, but I think it's a good place to start. The main point of this is that we want to add a lot of varying textures. So after I do the Typhus Corrosion, I add some AK Interactive Corrosion texture. It's similar, but adding it just adds a little bit more variation. It's not quite as bumpy as the Typhus Corrosion. Then we're going to add some Crackle Medium. Whatever brand works. Just make sure you apply it thick enough so that you manage to get those cracks. If you apply it too thin, it won't crack properly. Once those are dry, you're gonna prime it black. You can use a spray can, or in this case, I used Vallejo black out of airbrush. Then we're gonna do some pre-shading with the airbrush. In this case, Liquitex Titanium White. If you don't have an airbrush and you want to accomplish something similar, you can stipple with a thin down white. Just make sure you're hitting the areas that you want to be highlighted. Then we're going to grab our Citadel Mantis Warriors Green. Also through an airbrush. You could apply it by brush, but I think through an airbrush applies a little bit smoother. And we're going to paint over everything, whites and the black shadows as well. Then we're going to return with the titanium white and add some additional highlights. Now this is going to be much more focused on the top areas and focal points, so top of the shield, the face, top of the helmet for the horse here. And we're going to add Liquitex Vivid Lime Green, which is even more bright green. Then we're just going to black out the colors. Now in this video I'm going to use a lot of rust towards the end, or some rust products. If you wanted to do this metal, you would still probably want to black it out with this black, but you'll see later why you don't need to be super neat with it, because we're going to end up covering most of it anyway. And I'll just take advantage of this awkward silence to remind you that if you like this type of content, to like and subscribe. You know, it's a great way to help us out. We appreciate it. Thanks. So this is what it looks like once everything's blacked out, or most everything is blacked out at least. There's a couple areas, I think, like the horns, I don't black out because we're going to be base coating those different colors later on. Also, I am painting my horses black, so you know, if you're want to paint your horse a different color, obviously you'll want to do that differently. Yeah, this gives you a pretty good idea of the texture and why it's important that we did that before painting. But it is Nurgle, so we are going to add some weathering. And in this case, I'm going to start with some sponge weathering, and this is just going to make some chips. We're going to use Vallejo Dark Rust, which is a dark brown color. And yeah, we're just going to sponge around the areas, try and focus on the areas like the edges. And you know, areas that would have lots of wear, like the shield. Once you have those chips in, we're going to come in with the brush and do a bit of edge highlighting. We want to connect up those dots that we made with the sponge. You can also do a little bit of freehand here. You see me making a little etch here, maybe an arrow, you know, deflected off of his shield there or something like that. But yeah, just think of areas that would have lots of wear and tear, edges, and you know, generally the areas where that would be front facing are going to have a lot more weathering. And we're still continuing with the dark rust, and we're going to start painting in the leather areas here. Now he has a little bit of armor on the front of his boot there, so make sure you don't accidentally hit that with the brown. Yep, we're going to cover the whole boot. He also has some leather on his lance there. You could all optionally paint the cape in this manner as well, but I am going to paint the cape a kind of a weathered, dirty white color. But leather would be perfectly fine too. Now we're going to, while we're base coating things, we're going to base coat some of the horns. I go in here with Doom Bull Brown, which is kind of a reddy brown. Probably going to require a couple of coats because that green is pretty vibrant. Will probably show through if you only do one coat. Yeah, so yeah, make sure you're completely covering up that green undertone. Then we're going to grab MSP Harvest Brown. This is a really nice kind of orangey brown, not quite as red as Doomable Brown. And we're just going to focus on the tops here. We're doing some layering. If you want a bit more smooth, you can do some glazing in between, but I'm keeping it pretty rough because we're going to end up covering this with some contrast paint later. And yeah, you just want to focus this on the areas towards the base. So the base of the horns are closer to the head, the base of the, I guess these horns coming out of his chest here. You know, you want to base that closer to the armor. And you know, if he had horns on his helmet, you would do it closer to the head. Now we're going to do a mix of 1-to-1 Harvest Brown and Vallejo Green Brown. This Vallejo Green Brown is, well, it's what it is. It's green and brown. It's a little bit lighter, and again, focusing on closer to the base of the horn. Try not to cover up that previous layer of just the Harvest Brown. And then, I'm sure you could guess it, we're going to do one more layer of Vallejo Green Brown, smallest area, closest to the base. We just want to have that like kind of gradual gradient. It doesn't need to be super neat, again, because we are going to end up covering it with some contrast paint later. But you still want to have that gradient showing a little bit. And then we're going to add a little bit of black to the tips of the horns here. You know, this is kind of a to taste thing. You don't have to do this. You can do it thinner than I do. I prefer to layer it on thick enough so that it's a fully opaque layer. Some people like to glaze it on. It's really up to you. And look, we have another awkward silence, so I will remind you that over on Hobby Collab we do stream multiple times a week. So if you ever want to catch us live, yeah, swing by. We'd love to have you. All right, so now we're going to put a little bit of Cire brown. This is what I was talking about by covering the horn up. You can add this thin, you can add this straight out of the pot as I did here. Basically what this is going to do is blend all those previous layers together. So if you're a little messy with it, this should, you know, hide your sins here. The one suggestion I have is that when you are applying this contrast paint, make sure you're drawing your stroke towards the tip of the horn so that it all focuses on the black tip. For the leather, now we're going to do some sketchy, rough edge highlights around the edge of the leather with MSP Harvest Brown. We want to make the we want to make the strips look a little weathered here. This is a little bit more clear of a shot. It's not pure edge highlighting. We're not just drawing a line around it. We are adding some scratches. You know, we're not touching every part of the piece of leather. We want to make it look like it's maybe a little cracked and scratched up. Now we're going to add some Iraqi sand, which is kind of a tan, sandy bone color. We're just going to focus this area on smaller areas than the Harvest Brown. Think of the most heavily weathered areas where that, you know, that brown finish would really be getting scratched off. Also think of high use areas like the front of the boot and high fold areas. So if it's a pouch, think of where the pouch would be, you know, where's the stress point for the leather, you know, where's it getting folded the most? That's where you would want to add a little bit of this tan color. All right, so now we're going to focus on the cloak, and this is no airbrush here, so what we're going to do is we're going to stipple on some Vallejo English uniform. It's kind of a khaki color, and you're going to want to do this in multiple layers. Notice how thin the paint is here, and we're not smearing, we're not dry brushing, we're stabbing straight down. You're going to want to do this in a couple layers. It's very thin down paint, probably 5 parts water, maybe up to 7 parts water. And it's going to look messy as you apply it. I'm also applying the brown too. He has some cloth under his seat there. We're actually going to work this color up to a kind of a white ivory color, but we want to get these brown undertones first. Then you're going to move on to Vallejo Green Brown, again doing the same stippling, stabbing motion. You're basically going to cover most of what you did previously with English Brown, but you're going to leave that English Brown and that black base coat in the deepest shadows. You're going to move to Bone White, which is a bone white. It's kind of a, you know, ivory with a little bit more yellow and brown mixed in. And again, same idea. Think of the areas, focus on the high points of the cloak, the high areas, and ignore the shadows. You want to leave that brown color in the shadows. Then we're going to go up to ivory, which is a much brighter color. And again, just focus on the highest areas, maybe the tips of the cloak. That's something I like to do, get a bit of a gradient going towards the back of the cloak. And now what we're going to do is we're going to grab a contrast paint after this. And this is, I have mentioned it before, this is a technique I picked up from Richard Gray, who's an amazing painter. Just want to make sure I'm giving credit where credit's due. What we're going to do is we're going to add some Gorgrunta fur here. This is kind of a reddy brown, and you're going to apply it to the entire cloak. And while it's still wet, you're going to grab contrast paint and basically wipe it off. And what this is doing is basically staining the cloak. You can get a similar effect if you do this with oil or enamel paints. It's not exactly the same, but the main reason I want to do this is, one, it's more accessible. Most people have these paints. It's much faster. It dries much faster than oils. Oils tend to take, you're potentially waiting up to a day. Even with fast drying paints, you're looking at waiting up to half an hour to an hour. Now we're going to move on to the fur part of the cloak with some burnt umber, just kind of a warm brown. Just base coat it, make sure you're adding probably 2 coats, make sure you're covering up that black layer. Then we're going to move in with some Vallejo beige brown and just focus on picking out the hairs here, or the fur clumps here. If you wanted to do this faster, you could probably just dry brush it, but this is just how I painted this specifically. So, I'll show you the work-intensive way, and while telling you how you should probably just dry brush it. But while we're at it, we're going to do some mixing with Vallejo beige brown and bone white, and just focusing more on the tips, not covering up that previous layer entirely. And then we're going to come in with some bone white and just focus on the very tips. And yeah, here's a good shot. You can really see all that texture working. Normally, things you want to avoid texture and dirt like that, but I think it's really working for this Nurgle model. Then you're going to mix up some Citadel Athonian Camo Shade and Seraphim Sepia. That's kind of a greeny brown and a yellowy brown. And you're going to cover up the entire fur cloak area. This should, whenever I'm applying shades here, I'm trying to make sure I'm including at least a little bit of green to get that gross feeling to it. Then you're going to add Seraphim Sepia and Wildwood contrast together and cover up those. I'm going to give those leather areas a quick wash, just to give them a little more depth. Yep, and it is our always needed severed head. We're going to start with Vallejo Dead Flesh, which is kind of a yellowy green color. Same as always, just make sure you're giving it a couple coats to make sure it's completely covered. To highlight, we're going to add in some Vallejo basic skin tone to that dead flesh, and just do some rough highlighting on the head there. This is not this is not an area you want to draw a ton of attention to, but we still want to make sure we're giving it its proper, putting in the proper work to it, highlighting it, and yeah. So we're going to focus on, because the head is turned sideways, we're going to focus on one side of the nose, one side of the forehead, one side of the cheeks there. Think of the areas that would be more lit because they're facing upwards. This is an optional step, but this is something I like to do just to add a little bit more life to this dead flesh. Maybe that's an oxymoron. But just some very heavily thinned down red. I used gory red in this case, but use your preferred red here. And just adding it in the areas around the eyes and mouth. We're going to end up covering this with a wash, so that red is going to get dulled down a bit, so it won't quite look as insane as it does right now. But it does add just a little bit of color back to these lifeless heads. Then we're going to add some Gilliman flesh and Mantis Warriors as a 1-to-1 mix. I add in the Mantis Warriors because it's green and it kind of maintains that kind of putrid look to it, while giving it a little bit of that flesh color. Don't let it pull too heavily. As you can see me trying to draw out the contrast here. Don't forget to do the back of his head like I just did. So for the horse, we're going to mix some Vallejo black and some Vallejo dark rust, 2 colors we've already used. And we're going to do some just broad highlights here on the horse and in this case the hair. I decided to go with black hair for this severed head. And so, you know, I mentioned dry brushing earlier. This is, again, you can... I will actually end up dry brushing this just to show you that it also works pretty well. You can do the, you know, placed highlights, or you can just do a quick, you know, if you're looking to do trying to knock out a couple of units in a day, just get a quick dry brush. This black to brown, you know, highlight is pretty subtle, but I think it ends up working pretty well, especially with a Nurgle model. Then we're going to do some gloss varnish. We're going to do a little bit more weather. We're going to do some recess washing. We're also going to be working with some oils next, so having a nice gloss surface to work with is just, it makes it a bit easier. So I'm going to do a couple of things here, and you don't need to do all of these, but I figured I would show you them all anyway. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to grab some AK Interactive Rust Streaks, which is kind of a brown orange. It looks like old rust. I'm just going to put this in all the recesses here. You know, anywhere that some rusty water could get into, and you know, maybe this Nurgle guy doesn't bother cleaning it out, just put it in there. On the armor, you don't want to do this on the cloth and leather. Then we're going to grab some Winsor & Newton Burnt Sienna. This is a very orange, much more saturated rusty color. So we're going to apply in a couple areas, put a couple dots down. Then you're going to grab a clean brush, and you're going to start making some streaks here. So I've got a thin brush here, and I just pull straight down on that dot. Then you notice that's a pretty big dot of burnt sienna, but what's great about oil paints is that, you know, basically if you add a little bit of thinner, in this case I used white spirits or mineral spirits, it's basically an eraser. So you can see this big blob, I just completely cut it back. Right now it's like a much more you know, the shape we're looking for, and you can do that all over this entire model. So this is what it looks like after a couple of rush streaks. And now I'm going to add a burnt sienna wash, because I wanted to add a little bit more variation, a little bit more vibrant orange in a couple areas over top that previous AK rust streaks we had already done. Again, this is not necessary, it's just a nice way to add a little bit of variation here and there. Alternatively, you could just do this instead of the AK Interactive rust streaks. You know, when you're weathering something so heavily like this, it's really up to you how much you do. Once those are dry, we're going to hit the model with a matte varnish and start working on the few metallics we have. Or I guess in this case, what would be metallics, because we're not actually going to do metallics here. Nurgle doesn't strike me as someone who would have a lot of shiny baubles. So, yep, we're going to hit this with a matte varnish. And then we're going to use Dirty Down Rust. If you've never used this product, I'm sure you've heard of it. If you haven't, well, buckle up, because this stuff is amazing. So this is Dirty Down Rust. You just apply it straight out of the pot over the areas that would be metal. In this case, we'd previously blacked them out just for, you know, to make it easier to see what we're working on here. And you can see it in real time here. As I apply this rust, this Dirty Down Rust, it starts to look like rust. It starts to turn orange, and if you want to, you know, this stuff you can vary how it works, right? So if you add a little bit of water, it'll give you a different effect. If you apply it thin versus thick, I highly suggest if you are going to use this stuff, you experiment a little bit first. But I mean, just look at how it's already working. You can see that orange poking through the area we applied. Generally, if you thin it down, it tends to be a little more yellow. If you apply it thick, it tends to be more yellow. If you thin it down and do very thin layers, it tends to be more orange and brown. But again, I've had different luck. You know, it's not an exact science. Make sure you're experimenting with it. Here's an alternate way that you can apply it. I actually do a little bit of stippling here with this tiny little brush here, and it gives a different effect. And you'll see how different it looks here. So you look at the spear versus the area on the armor. It's going to end up looking very different dependent on how you apply it. Again, this is all straight. The tip is straight out of the pot, no thinning with water. Then I'm going to apply it to his chainmail skirts here. because if it's metal, it'll be rusted. Except for this little guy right here. You know, he's got a Stormcast helmet. We're going to make sure that gets gold, but we're not going to make it pristine. So what we're going to do is we're going to stipple some scale 75 Necro gold, and that's going to give you kind of a battered look to it. Then you're going to grab a brighter gold, in this case scale 75 Elven gold. Focus on the highlights, it's a bit more yellow. Focus on the top areas. Then you're going to grab a thinned down Vallejo black. Now I didn't use Nuln Oil in this case because Vallejo model color black is very matte. And you know, I thin it down probably 5 parts water to paint, and it really dulls down that metal without us having to add another varnish. You'll be able to see it a bit once we're done here. Then finally, once that's dry, you're going to come back with the Elven Gold and just stipple on a little bit more, and there you can see how much it's killed that shine with that previous black wash. And once that's dry, that should leave us with this. And there we have our nice, filthy Nurgle model here. It was a lot of fun painting this. I love weathering, and I hope you got something out of this video. If you liked the video, we'd appreciate a like on the video. If you want to share this around, we'd also appreciate that as well. Just like to say thanks for stopping by, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.